Okay, so a Stage 1 heister may start playing Payday 3 either because they've heard that the early issues like progression, server stability, and more recently the armor system are being addressed, or perhaps they're jumping in out of curiosity after all of the negative coverage the game has received, because surely the game can't be that bad, right? Regardless of the reason they pick up the game, they might rush through the tutorial or skip it entirely, assuming their FPS experience will suffice and deciding that anything unique about Payday's gameplay they'll pick up while playing the game. With most skills, weapons, and customization options locked, there's little to do in the menus for now, so they'll quickly jump into the first heist. No rest for the wicked. Loading into the heist, they'll notice that they don't yet have a weapon in their hands. Still, they'll enter the bank and see that the objective is to get past the security gate, and that requires them to turn off the power to the gate as well as disable the security system. If they're playing in a public lobby, which they most likely are as this is their first time playing the game, this is when another player is going to put their mask on and take the heist loud. Suddenly, the new player is masked up and armed. A short firefight breaks out between the bank security and the gang, and there's another objective now that involves setting up some thermite as well as some big red text on the screen telling them to trade a hostage to delay the assault. They might spot another player in the lobby tying up some hostages, so the new player will do what the instruction says and trade some of those hostages, perhaps noticing that the other players in their lobby aren't trading those hostages themselves though. They are tying them down, but not trading them. Someone might even run up to the new player and start firing their weapon, preventing any more hostages from being traded. Unsure why they would have done that, the new player turns their focus back onto the heist's main objective, only to find that the thermite is already set up and burning on the second floor of the bank. The heisters fend off some waves of cops, the Stage 1 player possibly noticing sprinklers or marked enemies during the assault, but doesn't really understand what these mean just yet. At a moment of respite, they're prompted to trade hostages once again, now for supplies, finally understanding why the others held off earlier. Eventually, the thermite burns through, providing an opening into the vault. Everyone else will start to toss down medic, armor, or maybe even ammo bags, prompting the newcomer to do the same, only to notice that their deployable has fewer uses. Once everyone's in the glass room inside the vault, following their teammates' lead, the Stage 1 heister will assist in disarming the die packs, maybe even losing a stack of money along the way. Heading out to the main road section of the heist that the new player didn't even know could be accessed earlier, they'll help the team disable the bollards. They might be the ones disabling the bollards themselves, or they might be covering their teammates as they do. A minute or so later, the getaway van will arrive, and they'll help bring the loot to it, likely coming across a heavy unit wearing bomb disposal gear on the way, that they'll run away from instead of trying to take on. Once everything has been loaded into the van, they'll jump in themselves, ending their first heist, where they'll become now officially a beginner. The Stage 2 heister returns to the menu after their first heist to see what exactly they earned. Clicking into the skills page, they'll quickly realize that there's still not a lot to work with just yet. Most skills are locked behind XP barriers, and they only have maybe 1 or 2 skill points to their name. Now that they've started to make some infamy progression though, the Stage 2 heister spends a little bit of time on the skills page, looking at what kind of build they might want to try and create. They've heard about ammo funnel and replenish, as well as the assassin skill line and fortitude, but don't really know what these actually do just yet. Also, jumping into the weapon selection, they might choose to run a different weapon, or perhaps add some attachments to their Car 4. With an understanding of how the first heist in the game progresses, they might choose to run it again, but this is when they'll start branching out into all of the other heists that the game has to offer, and maybe even stepping up the difficulty some more. They're not exactly ready to be taking on heists like Fear and Greed on Overkill, but they might be able to make their way through Dirty Ice on Very Hard, and that is an exciting feeling. They've not been playing the game for too long, but they can already take on some of the more challenging difficulties, and that makes the game feel very rewarding for them. The Stage 2 heister begins to learn how each heist works, and the different types of phases that can occur. They're finding themselves experiencing new waves like the final assault and endless FBI assaults more often, as well as discovering how to react and respond to those waves accordingly, with things like being able to take out the FBI van during an assault. They'll find themselves becoming more aware of the different types of enemies that can spawn as well, learning the roles sabotage squads and hostage rescue units play during a heist, as well as getting a hand of how to counteract naders and zappers. A Stage 2 player might have even figured out that by shooting some of these units in certain areas, they can cause their equipment to backfire, triggering an environmental effect that damages or stuns surrounding enemies. Still perhaps slightly intimidated by those dozers, and figuring out exactly how to track down the techie, this stage is when they'll learn the ins and outs of how to play each heist in loud. They're going to start contributing more to each heist's objectives, setting up the thermite, managing drills, entering codes, and picking up the meth once it's cooked.
I'm sorry, who the fuck picked up the meth?
Dude, what are you doing? Why would you pick it up so early?
Oh my god,
understand.
who picked
Why
up the
would you
meth
grab it?
before it
Why the
turned
fuck would you
blue,
pick that up early?
fucking
It's not
idiot.
remotely.
You fucking
Oh
kidding
my
me? Is it
God,
amateur hour
who
here?
did that?
Our value's in the
supposed to
toilet.
wait.
Jesus fucking Christ. People like you are why the kick function exists.
Maybe they shouldn't have done that just yet. They need to be careful not to get ahead of themselves as they don't know everything just yet. Once this player is more familiar with the general flow of loud gameplay and has enough skill points to put together a somewhat decent build, they might want to try being... The Stage 3 Heister has run each of the heists enough times to be familiar with their layout, usually in a loud and chaotic manner, leaving nothing in the vaults of banks or safe houses of luxury apartments besides for a pile of corpses. And as fun as that is, this might be when they think back to that first run of No Rest for the Wicked. They remember how the objective changed as soon as everybody put on their masks and bullets started to fly. They're going to want to go back and see how the heist plays out if nobody ever knew they were there. Enter the stealth phase. For some players, this phase never really ends. Instead, stealth becomes their primary playstyle. Others want to put this phase behind them as soon as they possibly can, going back to the guns blazing approach, and others still will flip-flop between the two styles as and when they desire. Playing the game in stealth requires the Stage 3 player to completely rework any builds that they've created so far. Certain skills that are immensely helpful in the early stages of loud gameplay are completely redundant in stealth. The Stage 3 player isn't going to have every skill point unlocked, so they still need to tailor their builds quite carefully. Stealth players will also gravitate towards completely different choices of equipment, gadgets, armor, and weapons. They'll need to completely rethink the way the game plays, and as such, their approach to heisting will change as well. They'll spend their time staying out of sight, sneaking past guards, hacking into cameras, stealing QR codes, and in the quieter moments, starting to pay attention to how the music sounds completely different in stealth, and escalates as the heist progresses, eventually and inevitably falling in love with the work of Gustavo Coutinho. The Stage 3 heister learns how to make their way through most of the heists in the game in complete stealth, experiencing the different type of tension and stakes that stealth gameplay offers. All the while, they're picking up little tips and tricks that could make loud gameplay even easier as well. They manage to complete their first heist without ever even putting on their mask, and feel very satisfied once they pull that off. They're starting to realize that certain heists might be easier if the first few objectives were handled in stealth and the final objectives were approached once loud. With this newfound and slightly more in-depth understanding of the way the game works, they want to jump back into loud gameplay, but now as... At this point, the Stage 4 heister has more than enough skill points to put together a real build. Not just something cobbled together with whatever was available to them before, but a focused, deliberate setup that suits their chosen playstyle. They're really starting to understand how to leverage hostages, not just to delay assaults, but as a way to manage their resources on some of the game's lengthier heists. Further to that, they also know when it's best to approach a heist quietly to begin with and only let the bullets start to fly once they know they can make it to the finish line. They've learned how to play each of the assault waves in a way that keeps them on top, knowing which objectives they can push for during an assault and which are best to be left until they have some breathing room. They still don't know exactly what every single skill in the game does, or how best to capitalize on skills like Assassin's Metal and Death Knell, but the build they're using is more than enough to get them through most heists on overkill. They might even be confident enough to take on some of these heists on their own with just the crew AI, leaving the Stage 4 player alone with the responsibility of completing every single one of the heist's objectives. The Stage 4 heister is also likely to start showing off some of their cosmetic items, purchasing different outfits, customizing masks, applying weapon patterns, and sticking on some unique weapon charms. Of course, they're also trying to get to grips with each weapon in the game, and that includes the overkill weapons. It's likely at this stage when they'll spot somebody running across the heist as a baseball bat wielding chicken, serenaded by some blood-pumping music, enticing them to pick up the jacket character pack. As these Stage 4 players step up the difficulty, they'll start noticing increased enemy spawn caps, and maybe start to get blinded by shields or overwhelmed by the amount of specials that are in a heist at any given time, which is going to prompt them to pay more attention to the difficulty modifiers. The builds they are using might be adjacent to some of the best builds in the game, but they haven't found anything truly special just yet. They could be using the assassin skill line combined with smoke grenades to keep their health up, but haven't necessarily discovered skills like Overcooked or Scrounger that make these kind of builds that much more powerful. Even if they have spotted those skills in the menus, they might not have the extra 2 skill points to spare. That said, it is during this stage when a player will reach level 100, obtaining all 28 skill points and hopefully unlocking every skill in the game, which is what's going to allow them to become Now that they could make any build they should desire, the Stage 5 player starts to mess around with all of the different combination of skills that they can think of. They might decide to run as little armor as possible and specialize into health and adrenaline skills on the fortitude line, while leveraging assassin's suppressor skills. But equally, they may take the opposite approach and decide to make armor their primary source of survivability, fully exploring the overhauled armor system. They'll also learn about perfect synergies, like the one we spoke about before, using Scrounger and Overcooked to really complete any assassin-focused smoke grenade build. They might also want to take some of the more obvious builds and add their own spin on them. For example, using the 3-plate armor frame vest with no intention of ever replenishing the final 2 chunks, and using the constant supply of throwables to leverage assassin without ever having to spend the skill points needed to unlock Scrounger, so they could put those skill points wherever they wanted. Eventually realizing that they're making a lot of mistakes in the way they create their builds along the way, a Stage 5 heister doesn't really care just yet, because they're enjoying that experimentation. Perhaps they'll return to the stealthing phase for a little bit to try out some different stealth builds, maybe using the Interceptor overskill ability for the first time. It's throughout this stage where a player will start to max out all of their different overkill weapons overskill lines, letting them play with these special weapons in different ways. The experimentation doesn't stop with builds alone. A player in this stage might choose to use some of the weapons that they haven't had much experience with just to see how they play, and in fact, they'll probably find their favorite weapons throughout this stage. Even if they aren't necessarily the best weapons in the game, they're the ones they find the most fun. The Stage 5 player becomes the kind of player they were in a lobby with back when they were only just picking up the game for the first time. They know a lot about the way the game works and might begin to get frustrated with newer players who make mistakes that affect the heist for everybody else. It's also during this stage when the player is likely to reach level 150, and starting their grind through the renown levels before realizing there's not really much point in doing that. Perhaps they'll begin starting to run out of things to do and looking for a bit of a challenge. A Stage 6 heister has conquered overkill difficulty. With the right team, or even by themselves, most heists in the game on the hardest difficulty can be completed quite easily, and even some of the harder ones aren't so daunting anymore. The game's core mechanics have become second nature to them. Their builds are refined and tailored to exactly how they like to play, and even the tougher special enemies don't seem to hit as hard as they used to. Now is when the player starts getting hungry for more of a challenge. They almost instantly blast their way through all of the achievements in the game and are quite surprised that there aren't any for the newer heists, but swiftly move on to the Kiss the Chef challenge, which requires them to secure 19 perfectly cooked bags on Overkill Cook-Off. Now they understand what those players were talking about when they were scolded for picking up the batch too early. They aren't able to complete the challenge first time round, neither by themselves or with a competent team, but eventually make their way through the over 45-minute ordeal and earn themselves the It's Not Meth charm for their efforts. Eager to jump into the next challenge, they notice that there isn't one. Scouring through the game's menus and glancing past the daily challenges that they likely take little notice of at this point, it becomes readily apparent that there are no more challenges in the game for them to complete. If they skipped over the tutorials when they first picked up the game, they might run through those just to have completed them in the game's menus and for the slightest bit of variety. But the Stage 6 player is rapidly discovering that there really aren't many challenges that the game encourages you to take on. They might decide to set themselves some self-imposed challenges or simply attempt to speedrun some of the heists, but at the end of the day, sooner rather than later, they're out of ideas for what to do next. This is when they decide to look online and become By now, the Stage 7 Heister isn't just playing Payday 3, they're engaging with the wider community surrounding it. Sure, they might have visited the Payday subreddit or watched a build video once or twice beforehand, but this time they're interested in fully tuning in. They might start to watch some challenge runs for inspiration and ideas for what they could be trying in their own game to keep the experience fresh. Perhaps they're interested in learning more about upcoming content. Equally, if they have certain issues with particular elements of the game, they might take to online forums to express their concerns and frustration in a manner in which the developers are likely to see. This is when they'll make some friends in the community and discover some of their favorite Payday creators, and hopefully, if they like what they see, they'll remember to subscribe. At Stage 7, they would start to come across the Payday 3 adjacent ARG website, the Dragon Files. Depending on how interested they are in the storyline and narrative, they might dive into all of the files on the ARG website, or maybe they'll just mess about playing some Don't Be a Hero. At some point or another, while engaging with the wider community, they're likely to come across something that makes them say, hey, how did they do that? Whether it's something as subtle as somebody hiding their HUD during gameplay, or as useful as color coding the skills page, this is when they'll encounter Payday 3's modding community. Mods are a hugely important part of Payday's core identity as a franchise, and somebody's journey with modding the game could deserve a whole 10 stages of its own. For now, I want to focus on a slightly different part of the community the Stage 7 Heister is likely to encounter and eventually become. After experiencing everything the game has to offer to the point where they've turned to the wider community for ideas about how they can enjoy the game further, the Stage 8 Heister is likely more than familiar with each and every one of the game's intricacies. As such, they have so many ideas about how the game could improve, or simply the content they'd like to see added in the future. Regardless of whether or not somebody at this stage decides to go ahead and share their ideas with the wider community, or just keep them to themselves, it's hard for them not to keep thinking about what they would do if they were on the development team. They'll start to apply some critical thinking to some of the game's base systems, like the skill system, that they're now realizing doesn't actually have all that much depth to it, and for some reason seems to revolve around the upkeep of 3 arbitrary buffs. Certain heist objectives, like the Wi-Fi circles, also start to be put in the firing line. Are these really the most fun objectives to be doing? Players in the game designer stage tend to take it upon themselves to propose new additions and reworks to old systems in the game, purely from a place of wanting to see the game improve. I should be clear, this is a really healthy stage for any player to be at. I don't want to make it sound like anybody in this stage is proposing any changes from a place of malice. Of course, the Stage 8 Heister has to be really careful that the way they express their suggestions comes across as constructive, and will occasionally risk raising something in a way that comes across as a little hostile, as it's coming from a place of passion, because some of the design decisions made really are quite baffling. But that only prompts them to look deeper into why certain decisions were made. By doing this, they uncover some of the stories from the game's development and suddenly understand why certain things are the way they are. Despite that, these things still need to be changed, though in the time it's taken this heister to go from Stage 1 all the way to Stage 8, it's likely that the next update is right around the corner, and they are about to get their first ride on the Payday 3 update roller coaster. The overall Payday 3 community sentiment is surprisingly quite cyclical. In the lead up to most updates, many are excited to see what's coming next, and each update tends to sound pretty great. This leads some people to say the now infamous line of "we're so back" before the update actually releases. Then, when we get our hands on the update and it doesn't instantly make the game perfect, we hear people saying that it's so over. And in its simplest form, that's the Payday 3 update roller coaster. It's a ride that every Stage 9 heister is going to go on at some point. The road to a better Payday 3 is a marathon and not a sprint, but that won't stop everybody getting caught up in the hype cycle before each and every update, anticipating it to be the one that saves the game. Did I ever tell you the definition of insanity? After experiencing this cycle once or twice, a Stage 9 heister is likely very conflicted. They genuinely don't know whether they should have faith in the game, or if its days are really numbered. It's difficult for them to get a gauge on the wider community, as there are still people playing and enjoying the game, but equally the game still has a long way to go before it's even a shadow of the game it should be. And in the cutthroat world that is the modern gaming industry, who knows if it's got enough fuel left in the tank to get it to where it needs to be. The same split opinion is something that they're they're seeing in the content they're consuming as well. Some of the creators they're watching are really positive and optimistic about Payday 3's future, and others are equally as skeptical. It is so tough for them to work out exactly how they should feel about the game and its current state. They know it's not perfect yet, but is it trending upwards or downwards? The hardest thing for the Stage 9 heister to face is that nobody really knows. They continue to follow the accurate indicators of the game's possible future, learning to disregard the significance of the game's current low PC player count, as that isn't representative of the game's potential, but instead focusing on things like the quarterly investor report, of which Q1 of 2025's actually paints a really positive picture. They also try to keep up to date with what content is being worked on, even if it's not going to be added to the game anytime soon. Coming to terms with the uncertainty of the game's future and realizing that nobody actually knows whether or not the game is going to recover, despite the optimists and pessimists within the community expressing that the game's fate is a foregone conclusion, is what allows a Stage 9 heister to become a Stage 10 heister is always around to take on a couple of heists. All you have to do is ask. They've played through each and every heist in both loud and stealth on all of the harder difficulties and are ready for whatever the future may hold. They're not blindly optimistic that the game is going to have a complete comeback, but equally they don't think that the game is absolutely doomed. They're able to come back with each update and see what's changed and what's new, and they're willing to let themselves enjoy whatever is there, but they're also more than happy to share their criticisms if they don't think a particular update is up to scratch. By the time they've reached Stage 10, they've found more nuance in what they have to say. Their thoughts on the game no longer fall into the two categories of "we're so back" or "it's so over," because as with everything in life, the truth is always somewhere in the middle. They have absolutely no intention of trying to convince people to give the game another chance or go out and buy it if they don't already own it. But by the same token, they also don't want to discourage anybody from giving it a shot if they may be interested. Even if they aren't necessarily playing every single day, they do genuinely want the game to improve regardless of everything that went wrong during the game's first year and a half. In fact, if the game stumbles again going into the second half of year 2 and even onwards, for as long as the game is receiving support, this player is going to come back to check out what that looks like every time. They don't see buying DLC as something that they're obliged to do to support the game's future, but neither do they see refraining from a purchase as some form of protest. They might skip a DLC or two if the content of that pack doesn't really seem of interest to them, but they're more than willing to pick up some content that they think they'll enjoy. Not everybody makes it all the way to becoming a Stage 10 heister. Many people will dip out at all different stages for one reason or another, but by making it all the way through the stages, they would have experienced Payday 3 at its highest, its lowest, and be ready for the future. If you can relate to any of these stages, or maybe even know which one you're in at the moment, let me know in the comments section down below. And if you're interested in learning more about what Payday 3's future might look like, you can click the video on screen now, and I'll see you in the next video.